Exploration and discovery are then open to everyone. They're not limited to the first person to do something or see something or travel somewhere. Instead, it's something that is shared by everyone who encounters what is to them or their people or their culture a new world. And in a time of deep divisions, this is something that unifies. This is the common inheritance of all human beings. We are wanderers. We are explorers from the beginning down to the present. We all explore. We have always been driven to discover.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this book talk series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at explorers and exploration in this country and beyond, the spirit that drives us to seek, to see, and to settle anew. Matthew Lockwood is Associate Professor of History at the University of Alabama. He earned his PhD from Yale and is the author of This Land of Promise, A History of Refugees and Exiles in Britain, and The Conquest of Death. His previous book was titled To Begin the World Over Again, How the American Revolution Devastated the Globe. That book was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Financial Times Top 10 Book of the Year in 2019. Welcome to you, Professor Lockwood. There is so much covered in your book, which I really loved reading, and I've enjoyed talking to you about it behind the scenes. It's fabulous armchair history travel, spanning from the mountains of India and China to Polynesia and Constantinople, from Viking ships to vessels that docked in Boston Harbor last century with immigrant families aboard. You have covered a tremendous expanse of land and sea in this short book, and there is so much to say here. So shall we start right in? I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to American Ancestors, the American Inspiration Series, and GBH Forum Network for inviting me to share my work. And this really is a passion project for me. And I'd also like to thank all of you who have joined in the webinar, who took the time out of your day to come and listen to me talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, which is the history of exploration. And I've always been interested in exploration. I've always been interested in my previous work in questions of movement and exchange, migration, imperialism. But I never thought I'd write a book about exploration. The origins of the book for me started with my move to the University of Alabama from England in 2017. In England, I taught at the University of Warwick, and it was a very different style of teaching. Those of you who are familiar with the UK educational system might know this. They teach a very sort of narrowly focused classes. I taught only history students. There were no other majors that I taught, and I taught very focused classes as a result. So I taught a class across the year on early modern English social history to give you a sense of the scope. And so when I moved to the United States, in 2017, I had to really shift how I taught and how I thought about teaching. And so when I arrived, I was asked to teach a class that was already on the books. Don't invent something new, don't reinvent the wheel. Take something that existed and try to make it my own. And so I looked through the course catalog and found a class called The Age of Exploration and Conquest. And again, this had been a long-standing interest of mine. I hadn't taught it formally, but I had been interested in global history and migration. And this class that was on the books, that was in the course catalog, hadn't been taught in years. So I wasn't stepping on any toes. It was something I was interested in. I thought students would like it. And so I thought I would dust this off and try to make this my own. So this course was very much what you might imagine a course on the age of exploration and discovery might be. It was a class in its original form that had focused largely on familiar figures like Columbus and Cortez, the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, the conquest of Mexico and Peru, things like that. And I realized that I could do something even broader with this, that this presented an opportunity to take existing interests that students had, interest in familiar figures like Columbus and Cortez, and use it to expand their horizons. I could remake the class in a way that it would allow me to talk about things that I was really excited about: migration, movement, cross-cultural contact, exchange, and conflict, all of these things that had motivated my previous work. I could use this class to talk about these things. And this is something I try to do in all of my teaching and all of my writing. I try to take a subject, an individual, or an event that people know about, and use that as a jumping off point to tell them about people and places and events that they might not know about at all. So in a previous book, for instance, about the American Revolution, I used the lens of the American struggle for independence to examine the consequences of the revolution for people outside of America, from the Caribbean to Peru, Germany, Russia, Sierra Leone, India, China, Australia. I tried to find the resonances everywhere across the globe. And so this is what I set out to do with my class on the Age of Exploration. And this is because fundamentally my perspective on history is that it should be a big tent. There should be space in the study of history and writing about and teaching about history for all sorts of interests. And I think sometimes, perhaps too often, academic historians in particular have a knee-jerk reaction to interest in things that are familiar or well-known. So interest in Columbus or Magellan. Historians often have a sort of acquired impulse to reject such interests as shallow or wrong, and to explain all the ways that exploration or imperialism are bad, instead of embracing the interest and trying to repurpose that interest. So I'm a Big Tent historian. I'm interested in all of history, and I embraced others' interests in history in general. So my class on exploration that I first started teaching years ago now, what I tried to do is I tried to complicate and expand rather than dismiss my students' interest. I tried to place new perspectives alongside the familiar and tried to expand their horizons. So for instance, alongside someone like Marco Polo, whose name at least they had heard of, I tried to tell them about the Moroccan traveler of a similar era and in similar parts of the world through the Middle East and into Asia, a man named Ibn Battuta. And alongside the expeditions, the voyages of Columbus and Magellan and Vasco da Gama, I tried to place the history of the Ming treasure fleets that sailed out of China a few decades before and explored the Indian Ocean world all the way to the coasts of Africa, Mecca and Medina. And so, of course, I told them about people like Captain Cook, the famous explorer of Australia and the Pacific. But I also told them about the Polynesians who Cook and other European explorers encountered in the Pacific and tried to understand these encounters from both perspectives. So the class now provides a bridge between their interest in the world as mediated through Western eyes and an interest in the world in its own terms, in its own right. But as I was teaching, I noticed I was doing something over and over again. And I think anyone who teaches or talks about exploration and discovery will end up doing this. I became conscious of the number of times I was saying discovery and discovered in quotation marks. I would explain that when Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, there were already people there, of course. And so I began to think, why am I using this term? I was contextualizing it. I was saying Columbus discovered the Americas from the perspective of Europeans, but of course there were already people there. And so I began to wonder, why don't I just get rid of the term, dismiss it, abandon it altogether? And so I asked myself why I wasn't doing this. Why did I cling to this term discovery, even as I qualified it? What value did the term still hold? And so what I decided was that retaining the term while reimagining it and reinterpreting it, those terms, exploration and discovery, held more value and more power than rejecting it. Because if Columbus could be said to have discovered the Americas, then indigenous peoples from the Americas equally discovered Spain and Portugal and England and France when the first of their people crossed the oceans from the Caribbean or Mexico or North America to find and encounter what was to them a new world of Europe. And this for me was perhaps in hindsight obvious but important revelation. If discovery is in the eye of the beholder, then exploration and discovery are not limited by time or place or culture. They're universal impulses shared by all human beings, from the first humans to leave the Rift Valley in Africa and set out across the globe, all the way down to the present. So exploration and discovery are then open to everyone. They're not limited to the first person to do something or see something or travel somewhere. Instead, it's something that is shared by everyone who encounters what is to them or their people or their culture a new world. And in a time of deep divisions, this is something that unifies. This is the common inheritance of all human beings. We are wanderers. We are explorers from the beginning down to the present. We all explore. We have always been driven to discover. So then I began to think, if exploration is not simply a matter of novelty, it's not about the first, what is it that unites all of these disparate explorers across space and time and culture? What do the traditional explorers and the new cast of explorers that I was imagining and I was beginning to teach about have in common beyond movement and travel? And so I came up with a couple of characteristics or actions, qualities that I thought defined this reimagined idea of exploration. And the first of these is imagination. This is the starting point for all explorers. Every journey begins in the mind's eye long before it ever takes physical form. Each and every explorer has to begin by asking what's beyond the far horizon and imagining what might be found there. And some of our earliest stories are exactly this, about journeys into the unknown. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the earliest story that survives from the deep past, is about a journey into the unknown. So is the Odyssey of Homer. And other stories too, other myths and legends about origins are often about travel, exploration, voyages into the unknown. From Choctaw origin stories, which told of a long migration from the far northwest down into the American South. Or the English origin story, one story for the origin of the English people, told of refugees fleeing the fall of Troy that Homer had described, and setting out on a long journey, a voyage that eventually led them to arrive on England's shores. So many of these early stories are about people imagining their past, imagining how they came to be, and thinking about this in terms of exploration. And thinking about imagination as a core component of exploration led me to reconsider some other groups of people not usually included in stories of exploration. So in some of my previous work on refugees, I read a lot of accounts of fugitive slaves, people escaping slavery in the British Empire, in the United States, and fleeing to a place of safety. And so I began to read these narratives in a new light and in a new way when I began to reimagine what exploration meant and what it encapsulated. I looked for the ways in which they imagined the world beyond their own immediate environment and the ways they talked about the natural world. And I think this is really important. It might be surprising at first to think about fugitive slaves as explorers, but I think this is exactly what they were doing, at least in part. And I think when we talk about enslavement, we tend to focus on the brutality, the violence, and the suffering. And this is vitally important, both as a central component of the experience of enslavement, but also as a reminder to people in the present. But suffering was not the only thing that enslaved people experienced. And focusing on suffering alone robs them of their full humanity. They felt love as well as sadness, excitement as well as dread, and they were moved by curiosity and imagination and wonder as they contemplated the world around them and the world beyond their own. And so just one example of this, I read this really powerful account of an enslaved man named Henry Bibb. Henry Bibb was born into slavery in Kentucky. And in his early years, he returned again and again to a high bluff above the Ohio River, looking from Kentucky into Ohio, and imagined what lay beyond the silver ribbon at his feet in the land of freedom, the land of liberty as he thought of it. And it was his imagination of what his life might hold beyond the far horizon, what it might be like there, that led him to undertake his journey, several journeys as it turned out, into the worlds that he had imagined so often. And along the way, he continued this with his imagination and curiosity, and he describes the landscape and the natural world, the things he encounters, with the curiosity of a romantic poet and the attention to detail of a naturalist. And so I began to think people like Henry Bibb were exploring too, they were discovering too. So as the story of Henry Bibb suggests, another of the key components, the characteristics of exploration that I began to study and investigate is the idea of curiosity. So this is, imagination might inspire someone like Henry Bibb or classic explorers that might be more familiar. They might inspire them to think about the world beyond their own. But it's curiosity that drives the explorer to take the first step, to go from imagining a journey to the reality of a journey. And I think there's a wonderful example of how these two things connect. And this is a story that comes from Louisiana. So in the 1720s, a French explorer named Antoine Lepage du Prat heard stories about tribes around his outpost in Natchez, who claimed their ancestors had migrated to Louisiana from somewhere far to the northwest. Lepage asked around for someone who could confirm these stories and tell him more about these foundation myths. He was curious. And he was introduced to an elder of a Yazoo tribe named Monkachta-Ap, who not only confirmed the Yazoo beliefs about their ancestors migrating from far away to the northwest, but who had personally gone in search of his Yazoo origins. So sometime in the late 17th century, he told Lepage, his family had all died, possibly of disease, and bereft, he set out to search for his origins. He traveled north up the Mississippi to the Ohio River, then on past Niagara Falls to the Atlantic coast, then retraced his steps back to the Mississippi and headed northwest up the coast to the headwaters of the Missouri and what is now Montana. And there he took a westward flowing river that locals called the Beautiful River that spilled out into a great Western Ocean, which Lepage assumed was the Pacific. And so when this French explorer returns to France in the 1750s, he writes down this account, he publishes it. And an English edition is eventually published as well in 1763. And a copy of this was owned by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had great interest in what might exist in the west of North America. And this interest was further motivated in 1804 with the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson had purchased 800,000 and more square miles of territory west of the Mississippi from France, had little idea what might lay there, and so he creates a corps of discovery in 1804 to explore this territory. And this is the famous expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And this territory, as we see in this map here, this contemporary map here, was very much parts unknown. And Jefferson wanted to ensure that the leaders he had chosen for this corps of discovery, Lewis and Clark, were prepared for what they might find. And so among the supplies that Lewis and Clark carried with them on their journey to the Pacific was a copy of Lepage's account of the traveler Monkachta-Ap, which I just think is a remarkable series of convergences. But Jefferson was curious about so much about the West, and he imagined all sorts of things which might exist there. He imagined that Lewis and Clark might find all sorts of wondrous things in the West, including living fossils still roaming across the plains. And he had reason to believe this might be so. In 1797, the fossilized bones of a strange creature with huge teeth and ribs like rafters were found in Kentucky. And Jefferson, head of the newly established Bone Committee of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, determined that the bones were similar to those of the woolly mammoth recently excavated in Siberia. So for Jefferson, this was a monumental discovery. These fossils were more than merely scientific for him. At the time of their discovery, many scientists accepted the Comte de Buffon's theory of American degeneration, So according to Buffon, New World peoples and animals were smaller and weaker than their Old World counterparts due to a process of degeneration caused by climate and geography in North America. And so the implications were profound, especially for a new nation in North America. If animals, including human, degenerated, then the people of the newly independent United States were bound to degenerate too. The American experiment was then perhaps biologically doomed to fail. And so, desperate to prove Buffon wrong and to prove that the animals and peoples of the New World and the Old were equal, Jefferson seized upon the fossils, these newly found fossils of prehistoric megafauna, as proof. But Jefferson not only believed that this was ancient evidence of large animals roaming North America, he believed that these might still be alive and thriving somewhere in the West. In fact, in his written instructions to an earlier expedition to the West, Jefferson insisted that the mammoth is particularly recommended to your inquiries. And when the Corps of Discovery was later formed, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis to Caspar Wistar, an expert on fossils, so that he would have the skills to uncover and identify fossils for himself as he traveled across the West. And so when Lewis heads west to link up with William Clark and the rest of the expedition, he stops at a mastodon excavation in Kentucky and sends a report back to Jefferson. And then in their travels, Jefferson charges them with looking out for living mastodons, investigating the animals of the country, especially any which may be deemed rare or extinct. Now, of course, Lewis and Clark did not encounter any living mastodon in the West. But when they finally reached the Pacific in January 1806, they did find a monstrous fish. And this is perhaps one of my favorite stories of the whole Lewis and Clark expedition, because it's one of the only moments in the many written records of the expedition that survive where we hear something of Sacagawea's voice. So Sacagawea had little say in how her life unfolded right up until that moment on the Pacific coast in 1806. She had been kidnapped at 12 and sold into a forced marriage with the French-Canadian fur trapper Toussaint Charbonneau at the age of 13. At 16, Charbonneau was hired by Lewis and Clark to serve as a guide and translator, and again she had little choice but to join the expedition too. But when the expedition reached the coast and learned that there was a whale beached there, Sacagawea finally put her foot down and demanded something for herself. And what she demanded was to see the ocean, to see the whale personally. What she said to Clark, according to Clark, was she observed that she had traveled a long way with us to the great waters, and that now that a monstrous fish was also to be seen, she thought it very hard that she should not be permitted to see either. She insisted on going, and she did go. She went to see the whale. And this is such a powerful expression of curiosity and its power to motivate travel, even in the face of adversity, even for someone who hadn't had a choice about whether to join the expedition. She had heard stories about the sea all of her life. She would not be left behind. Her curiosity drove her to seek out that whale. And so thinking about exploration in these new terms, thinking about imagination and curiosity, allows us to reimagine all sorts of famous moments in history. And this image here is one such scene. This is the moment when the Welsh-American journalist Henry Morton Stanley greets the famous and famously lost Scottish missionary Dr. David Livingstone. Meets him in the wilds of Central Africa with the powerfully laconic words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." But if we alter our perspective just a bit, we find a host of other stories surrounding this famous moment that are every bit as interesting. So Stanley sets out for Africa in 1871. He sets out to make his name. He's a journalist. He comes from a difficult background. He hopes that finding Dr. Livingstone, who has disappeared in Central Africa, will make his name. But he has no idea what he's doing. He's not an explorer. He has no experience. So he travels first to Zanzibar, on the coast of East Africa, where other expeditions had started out. And so when he gets there, what he decides to do is recruit the guides and porters, men that are called in the area the Faithfuls, who had been on expeditions of previous explorers, especially those of Richard Francis Burton and John Hanning Speke, who had recently become famous across the world for discovering the source of the Nile. These figures that he meets, people like the Faithfuls or people like Sacagawea, guides, interpreters, porters, they're not usually included in the roster or in the ranks of explorers in most treatments. Most discussions of these sorts of figures have either ignored them entirely or treated them more like beasts of burden than as individuals motivated by the same things that motivated other explorers. Or they focused on their suffering and exploitation, the suggestion being that they were forced to go, or they only went because they were desperate, they needed money. But I think they did so much more than shoulder heavy burdens. They looked up and around at what were to them new worlds too. They looked around with interest, with awe and curiosity, and wondered. And they told people back home what they saw, and they were transformed in the eyes of their own culture by what they had done in the scene that they had, everything that they had seen. And I think the best piece of evidence for that is that when Stanley finds the Faithfuls who had led these previous expeditions, they still all had the medals given to them by the Royal Geographical Society in London for their role in the discovery of the source of the Nile. If all that expedition had meant to them was a paycheck, they would have pawned the medals long ago. But they didn't. They kept them. These were artifacts to them. This was evidence of their changed status as explorers too. And so some of these faithfuls do agree to sign up with Stanley to go in search of Livingstone. And when they finally do find Livingstone, it was another remarkable pair of guides who first greeted Stanley, not Livingstone himself. And these were these two men, Chuma and Susi, who had been traveling with Livingstone for years by the time of the famous encounter with Stanley. And they continued traveling even after Livingstone's death. So Livingstone dies in Africa, and Chuma and Susi and his other guides and porters decide that they won't bury him there in Africa, that they'll instead carry his body to the coast. And then Chuma and Susi take ship with the body back to England, or be buried in Westminster Abbey. And then they go to Scotland to visit his relatives and help assemble and interpret the many papers and diaries and letters that Livingstone had left behind. And they are eventually recognized as explorers by the Royal Geographical Society too. And I think when we start reimagining what these categories mean, we recover these stories in important ways. So the third category that I began to investigate after imagination and curiosity was the idea of wonder, a sort of emotional response to the things that are found or seen. And I think there's a great example that comes from 1912, an American explorer named Roy Chapman Andrews. Roy Chapman Andrews was a young man at this time. He was mostly a marine biologist at this point, but he had gone to whaling stations in Japan and Korea to study whales. But after he was done with this, he wanted to see parts of Korea that others in the West had never seen. He wanted to go to the far north, to the Long White Mountain, a mountain that is really important in Korean mythology as the place of birth for the Korean people. And he needed people to help him along the way. He didn't know where to go, and he couldn't carry all his equipment. So he recruited, they were mostly strong-armed by Japanese soldiers, a group of Korean mafus. And the journey was atrocious. It was awful for all of them involved. It rained constantly. They were often in mud up to their waists, trying to pry the pack animals that were carrying their gear out of this mud. And Andrews was constantly worried that the Korean guides and porters would desert him, that they would give up and go back home. But they persevered, they kept on going. And when they arrive at the Long White Mountain, Andrews describes the overwhelming joy that the Korean mafus exhibit when they see the Long White Mountain. This is something that for them had huge amounts of meaning, and something that they had never thought they would see in their lifetime. And there it was right before them. And so again, I think we often overlook these figures who are so integral to the success of expeditions of exploration, but were explorers too, that looked around themselves with this sense of wonder. Another great example comes from the travels of Sir Francis Younghusband, who also traveled around Asia, mostly Central Asia, the Himalayas. And when he was traveling through Western China on one expedition with a Mongol guide named Matala, Younghusband was perplexed and a little bit frustrated by a habit of his guide. Matala kept collecting what, to Younghusband's mind, was trash: a bit of string, the wrapper of a package, an old sock. Younghusband wanted him to throw these things out and couldn't understand why he kept collecting them. But it finally became clear when they arrived in Matala's hometown, when he took out these artifacts, not rubbish to him, but artifacts, and reverently showed these objects to his friends and family. This was evidence of his adventures, tangible proof of his experience, his status as an explorer. There were symbols of how he had been changed by his exploration. He was now a man who had seen the world, and he had evidence, he had proof, and he could put this proof before his friends and family. And so again, there's this sense of wonder that we see in all sorts of figures, both the familiar explorers and the less well-known. The fourth characteristic that I think is vitally important to think about when thinking about exploration is the idea of exchange. So contact between two individuals, two peoples, two cultures or societies is always about negotiation and exchange. Exchange of language, exchange of objects, trade goods, but especially the exchange of knowledge, ideas, ways of seeing, and ways of knowing. And there's a wonderful example that comes from the early 18th century. So in 1716, Mary Wortley Montagu traveled to Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, with her husband, who had been appointed the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, whose capital was at Constantinople. Europeans of her day were fascinated by the Muslim world, but most travelers, most of them were men, were not able to explore many of the things that most fascinated European audiences: Turkish baths, harems, things like that. As a woman, Montagu could enter these sorts of spaces and could learn the truth about them. And she upended many of the myths, the sort of salacious myths that previous male explorers had reported about Turkish baths and harems and things like this. But Montagu could do even more. She could meet with and exchange with Turkish women. She could visit them in their homes. And this paid huge dividends, not just for Montagu, but for English and Western society and Western medicine. Because on one visit to one of these Turkish women's homes, she witnessed a medical procedure performed by women, and it was always performed by women. And this was variolation, a form of inoculation for smallpox. It developed in China centuries before, and it was widely known across the Muslim world, but largely unknown in Europe. She witnessed this procedure, witnessed its effects, and had her son inoculated in this way. And when she returned to England and smallpox broke out there in 1721, she became an advocate for the practice, urging the Princess of Wales to inoculate her children, which she eventually did, and publishing an anonymous pamphlet supporting inoculation. And so again, you can see the power of exchange to change both sides of the equation in these moments of exploration. Another wonderful example of exchange comes with this map. This map was drawn by Tupaya. He was a Tahitian man who joined Captain James Cook's famous expedition when his ship, the Endeavour, anchored in Tahiti in 1769. And Tupaya was a remarkable figure. He was a star navigator in the Polynesian tradition. He had been trained to understand, to remember, to be able to picture and visualize the position, size, reefs, harbors, produce, chiefs of scores of islands across the Pacific, South Pacific, many of which he had never been to personally. But he knew where they lay. He could draw them from memory, and he could guide Cook or anyone else to these places. He knew the time it took to travel between them, even if he had never been there. And he knew the succession of stars to follow to reach each of these islands. And so he joined this expedition of Captain Cook and helped guide them through the South Pacific. He intended to go all the way to England. He was fascinated with the idea of Europe and wanted to see it for himself. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. He died of disease in Indonesia on his way. But he left these remarkable drawings, both the map, but also drawings of the things that he encountered. Another last wonderful example of exchange and the power of exchange comes with the figure seated here. This is John Edmonston. He was born into slavery on a woodcutting plantation in Guyana. In 1812, a Scottish explorer named Charles Waterton stopped at this woodcutting plantation and taught Edmonston the art of taxidermy, especially how to preserve birds. A few years later, in 1817, Edmonston was taken to Scotland. There he obtained his freedom, and looking for a way to make his living, he set himself up as a bird stuffer, a taxidermist of birds in Edinburgh. About a decade later, he'd become well established. He was well known as a taxidermist in Edinburgh. And one day, a rather morose medical student who didn't want to be a doctor, who was mostly interested in the natural world, walked into his taxidermy shop looking for a place of refuge, a kindred spirit, someone also interested in the natural world. And this medical student, of course, was Charles Darwin. Edmonston taught Charles Darwin how to preserve birds. And he taught him in a specific way because Edmonston had learned in a warm weather climate in Guyana how to preserve birds. And this required much more rapid preservation. And so when Darwin, this is Waterton, the plantation where Waterton taught Edmonston taxidermy. So when Darwin embarks later on his famous voyage on the Beagle, on the HMS Beagle, reaches the Galapagos Islands, notices the variety of finches and how they were all perfectly suited for their own individual environment, and developed his theory of natural selection from these observations. It was the techniques taught to him by John Edmonston in this wonderful moment of exchange that helped him preserve the finches, that allowed him to make this wonderful discovery. The last characteristic I want to talk about today is interpretation. So explorers set out into the world, but they also gather and process information about the places that are new to them or to their culture. And then they situate that information within a worldview that their culture will understand. They see and explain the world for people like themselves. So again, this doesn't have to be the first time that someone has seen something. This doesn't have to be new. It just has to be a reinterpretation. And so a wonderful example comes with another man who was born into slavery. And this is David Dorr. He was born in Louisiana. When he was a young man, his enslaver asked him to come with him on a trip through Europe and the Mediterranean. And he promised that if he did so and accompanied him as his servant, when they returned to the United States, he would set him free. So Dorr, of course, agrees to go. And Dorr is fascinated by the world. He goes to England and France, the Netherlands, to Italy, to Constantinople. He goes to all of these places, and he's a wonderful writer about all sorts of things. But I think the most powerful is when he reaches Egypt, and he stands before the pyramid. And for him, this is the moment where everything sort of clicks into place. Because for Dorr, the pyramids are powerful evidence that cannot be ignored of the civilization of Africans. He says that it was the Egyptians who taught Moses. It was the Egyptians who taught the Greeks and the Romans and who preceded them. That they had created one of the first great civilizations, and they were Africans like him. So now, of course, David Dorr was not the first person to see the pyramids. He was not the first American. But he brought to the pyramids a new perspective, a new way of seeing and understanding the pyramids based on his own background and his own experience. And he was able to interpret them anew for people back home. And so we all see the world through the lens of our culture, but explorers also present the wider world to us through our own eyes. They travel for us. They explain the world for us, just like David Dorr did. They bring information back to their communities, and in the process, they revise and remake our understanding of the world beyond. This is from David Dorr's written account. When he goes back to the United States, he does obtain his freedom. He moves to Ohio and he publishes a remarkable account of his travels, and this is from his travels through France. And so I think when you take these characteristics into mind, you see a whole new host, a whole new cast of explorers open up. New people, new groups qualify as explorers based on these terms. So you see indigenous peoples at first contact and when they traveled to Europe. You see guides, interpreters, and porters. You see fugitive slaves, and you see immigrants and migrants too. Now, many immigrants and migrants left their homes because they were forced out by poverty, by violence. And yet they too were driven by the worlds they imagined were waiting for them at the end of their journeys. And in their writings, they retained their sense of curiosity and wonder about the new worlds they were encountering. And this, again, when I was working on my book on refugees, this was something that struck me so powerfully, was the letters, especially the letters back home, that immigrants and migrants wrote, described the world, interpreted the world, motivated by curiosity and imagination and a sense of wonder. They did all of these things in just the same way that explorers did. And so I think of them as explorers too. I could, of course, go on and on about this topic. There's so many fascinating stories to be told. There are so many more in my book, and there are thousands beyond. But I'd like to hear what all of you think as well. So I'll leave it here to save some room for questions.
Matthew, thank you so much. That was a really rich education. We're getting a lot of questions about the photographs and the images in the book, and how many of them are in your book, and or what you gathered on screen. It's probably what you've shown your students over years. The book is a small trim size, and it's on mostly on paper. But how did you possibly pick the images for the book?
Yeah, so we're always limited by space with books, and so I try to choose images that represented each of these characteristics and one of the individuals that I was talking about. And of course, I would have loved to have had all of the images here and many, many more included in the book. But yes, you're right that these are the sorts of images I show my students because I think images are so important. I think they really connect. The viewer to the ideas and the moments. And I love trying to immerse people, readers or students in these worlds, in the stories of these individuals. And so I try to do that in writing and in lecturing, but I also hope to do it through images too, because I think that's a really powerful way to do it.
Well, we're very lucky to be your students tonight. And working as I do as a producer of literary events and for a family history organization, I am keenly interested in the intersection of exploration with writing, literature, documentation, chronicling. The genealogists and the historians among us are driven to do research, to look at critical records that help them piece together history, just as you've done. They're in pursuit of source documents, and as you do, I love this word you said. We're all amplifying whispers, reading between the lines. Your book is very much about historical accounts and the power of the written word. It's also about objects, about that hold memories and memorabilia, as you said, that guide who held string. Following up along those lines, I was wondering if you might comment about the power of documenting, of writing down and recording. You said in the book that Marco Polo's book called Travels was an inspiration to others. Can you talk about the publication of that work in particular, what it was, what his motivation was for doing that writing, whom it inspired, and how he got the word around? We do have an audience question about communication. How did these folks communicate back?
Yeah, I mean, one of the wonderful things about Marco Polo is in part he had it written down. He couldn't write himself. He had it written down because no one believed him. So he traveled from Venice all the way to China, through parts of India, spent decades in Asia. And when he returned, first of all, everyone assumed that he was long dead, and so didn't believe he was who he said he was. But even after they finally confirmed that he was Marco Polo, they thought he made up most of the stories about what he saw. In fact, they started calling him Marco of the Millions because he kept saying the wealth of the great Khan, the ruler of the Chinese Empire, wealth could only be measured in millions, and so people thought he was exaggerating, he was making it up. And so when he was in prison, there was a war between Venice and its great trading rival Genoa, and he was captured during that war, and he was in prison, and he found himself imprisoned with a writer of popular romances named Rustichello. And so he asked this writer to write his story down. And he says in it, "This will be a story of the things I saw. This will be truth." He's really trying to get home that this really happened. And it becomes widely read. So this is before the printing press. So these are all sort of hand copied manuscripts for a long time. But it spreads across Europe. It's translated into almost every European language, and people read it, but they read it for entertainment. Most of them don't think it's true. One of the few people who does, though, is Christopher Columbus. So Columbus tries to gather as much evidence about the world, about Asia, which is where he's trying to go, as he can. And so he reads through a copy of Polo's travels. He makes his own notations. He bases some of his calculations about the size of the world and the possibility of sailing around it to reach Asia based on Marco Polo's account. And so Polo continues to be inspirational to those who believe him.
Fascinating. I love the Columbus connection. I'm also interested in immigrants as explorers, and you brought this up. You did also mention in the book that in the early 20th century, there was a great swell in the number of diaries written. In relation to these and their content, you used the phrase that they show the language of discovery. They put that on display. Can you tell us a little bit more about the swell in diary writing and what precisely is the language of discovery?
Yeah, so when we get into the second half of the 19th century, when in the case of the United States, we see huge growth of migration. We're also luckily in a moment when literacy is growing, and I think people across the world are writing more and more, but immigrants in particular are writing, and that's because they have something vital to do with their writing, to keep a connection with people back home, but also to inform them, to interpret what they're finding for people back home. And it's in these accounts, these letters and diaries, that you see them using this sort of language of discovery. They're using similar terms. They're interested in similar things about culture, about landscape, about terrain, geography, all of that, that we see in accounts of explorers. And again, this is one of those things where I saw the connection sort of immediately, and just thought, oh, this is so fascinating that they're using the same terms, they're interested in the same things, and of course, some of them might have read or known about the accounts of the great explorers, and most of the immigrants that I've read don't think of themselves in those terms, but are absolutely doing many of the same things. And so trying to sort of recover those voices, and think about them in this other way, for me, was really important.
Fascinating. All right, shifting to audience questions. I wonder how Professor Lockwood would relate his notion of exploring to European institutions of wandering, like wandering scholars in the Middle Ages, journeymanship as a normal stage in qualifying for craftsman status, and also to the cult of wandering in the Romantic period in the 20th century. Wandering, not a term we think of often.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the sort of misconceptions we have about the past, especially about periods like the Middle Ages or something like that. We think about them as very rooted, that people were born and died in the same place. They grew up in a small village and married someone from the village and never went more than 5 miles to a closest market town or something like that. But people have been moving since the beginning. We are a wandering people, and they do it for all sorts of reasons. As the question asks, suggests, wandering for study, wandering for trade, for occupation. I think that's something important to remember is that we're always on the move. So many of us are constantly moving about. And so, my class that I started was called the Age of Exploration. And one of the things I had to do is, define what that means. And of course, in the classic sense, that usually starts with Columbus, or maybe you start with Marco Polo. But for me, there's no bounds to the age of exploration. You might talk of an age of reconvergence, but people have been moving across time for all sorts of reasons. And I think what all of these people are doing is very much exploring, especially when they are thinking about it in these terms, when they're interpreting things, and we're constantly doing that as we move throughout the world. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful question and wonderful observation too about the idea of wandering.
Getting down to some nitty-gritty questions, have you considered writing a story of the early fur traders that settled in eastern Washington, the Idaho Panhandle, or in northwest Montana?
Yeah, the fur traders are really interesting figures. They are interesting for the ways in which they exchange with local peoples. They have to. They are not bringing their civilization with them in that way. They need to rely on the people they meet and encounter. And so they're great examples of exchange. I also think they're fascinating because I think we tend to think about fur traders and people like that as motivated primarily by money, that furs are valuable. Beaver make wonderful hats that are all the rage back in London. And so they're going out there because they're trying to strike it rich. And of course, there's some truth to that, and to people like prospectors and others seeking gold. But it's about a lot more than that. There are lots of ways to try to earn a living, and this was being a trapper on the frontier was not an easy one. Um, and we don't have a ton of accounts written by them, but when we do, they are rich in this sort of language of discovery too. And some of these accounts are also doubted too. There's a great example of one of the early fur traders who's one of the first Europeans or Westerners to stumble upon Yellowstone. And he describes it to people back home. He writes about it, and they just dismiss it. They think it's a product of a feverish imagination. He had been injured at the time, and they thought, oh, the fever set in, delusions. He imagined the whole thing. But yeah, so I think they're wonderful examples of exploration, and again, this idea that it's not just money that motivates people, including groups that we usually associate with being motivated by money, but they're motivated by imagination and curiosity and wonder and all of these things. And so yeah, it's a wonderful idea.
We're getting a number of questions about Pocahontas,
Hmm.
and one that came in advance. When Pocahontas died, had she previously been back to Virginia? And then a live question: what about Pocahontas?
Yes, yes, yeah. Another wonderful example, both of exchange. Yeah, you know, so many examples from the early settlement of the Americas by Europeans that survival wouldn't have been possible without this exchange of knowledge and perspective between the sort of go-betweens, people like Pocahontas. So fascinating figure. Unfortunately, she doesn't make it back to Virginia. She arrives in Plymouth, England, in 1616. She goes with her husband, John Rolfe, and is sort of greeted by the great and the good, including royalty. Attends a masque put on, a dance put on by Ben Jonson, and boards a ship in London to return to Virginia, but falls ill at probably gloomily named Gravesend on the Thames, and dies. She's taken off the ship, she dies, and she's buried there. So she never makes it back to Virginia, which again makes it, a powerfully tragic story, but a fascinating figure, wonderful example.
Okay, our last two questions, I'm going to put them together, are about colonial expansion. A question that came in live. Wasn't much of world exploration funded by European monarchies? Thus, explorers were doing it for sponsorship and possibly some glory in those countries: Spain, Portugal, France, Great Britain. From what I've read, many explorers in their old age were destitute, penniless when they died. And then a similar question: can you talk about the official expeditions that were compelled by kings and by other political leaders, and the difference in accounts between crews who may have been who may not have been apprised of what the journey's mission truly was versus voluntary service on announced expeditions, which may have been widely advertised and recruited? So the experience of the folks who led these that were sponsored by monarchies, and also the people on these expeditions. And this will be our last question.
Yeah, so many of the sort of great expeditions of discovery were sponsored or funded by monarchies or state governments. Um, uh, Not all of them. Some of them, many of them, were motivated by quest for knowledge and, of course, notoriety and the financial benefit that can go with that. Um, and then we're often those expeditions were often followed up by official expeditions seeking to exploit the land or the market or whatever. But many of these people had to shop around their expeditions. Columbus is a famous one. He shopped his idea to sail around the world to the riches of the spice markets of Asia, to pretty much all the monarchs of Europe, to the King of Portugal, to the King and Queen of Spain who rejected it the first time around, to the King of England who rejected it, and eventually the Spanish agreed, and uh, to answer the question of penniless, some of them do, not all of them, but some of them do. Some of them just can't stop, and so keep exploring and end up, dying of disease or something. Columbus dies not quite destitute, but definitely disappointed. He had been promised basically a huge cut of everything he discovered by the King and Queen of Spain. And of course, nobody knew that there was a continent between Europe and Asia. So when he discovered this, he thinks he owed a cut of all of the proceeds that come from the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which would be a huge amount of money. But the King and Queen of Spain revoke this, and they end up being in lawsuits for the next couple hundred years over the proceeds for this. But yeah, and in terms of recruitment for the guides and porters, yes, sometimes they are kept more in the dark about the true ends of the expedition, or sometimes just not told because the person leading it doesn't think it matters to tell them. Um, but there are others who sign up for these expeditions, even if they don't know all of the details, but for similar reasons of curiosity. And there's a wonderful one, and it's one of the only accounts I've seen written by a guide or porter. And his name is Rasul Galwan, and he leads a series of expeditions in the Himalayas and in Central Asia. And he actually writes down an account of his time, and the way he describes it, he has that wanderlust. He wants to see what's beyond the far horizon, and he does get paid, and his status goes up in his own community and in the eyes of Westerners as a result of his experience and his expertise. But he's very much also doing it just because he's so in awe of the world around him and wants to see as much of it as possible.
That's a remarkable chapter in your book. I really like the Rasul chapter. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Matthew to do a final reading from his book. So over to you for that.
Thank you. Explorers have had a stubborn and enduring legacy. Many still want to believe that there are people who risk their lives in pursuit of nothing more than knowledge and adventure, who journey into the unknown corners of the world simply to see what might be seen. Many still want heroes. And thus, the heroic image of the explorer endures in our popular culture, from novels to the screen. A valiant captain astride the deck of a storm-tossed ship, eyes fixed on the world he hopes to find beyond the gale. A khaki-clad adventurer hacking his way through a tangled jungle in quest of some long-lost city. A mountaineer inching his way across a perilous chasm, a thin rope all that separates survival and disaster. Such depictions often lie in an uncomfortable juxtaposition with what we know about the entanglement of exploration and imperialism. And it's tempting to discard the terms discovery and exploration altogether, to consign studies of explorers to the dustbin of history. But if we discard the history of exploration, we discard a vital element of the human story along with it, a story that transcends culture, ethnicity, and geography. Indeed, it is impossible to understand the history of humanity or fully comprehend the human condition without understanding the universal impulse to explore. Discovery and exploration can be recovered, but only if they are reimagined and reconstructed. It begins by recognizing that this desire to explore, this essential curiosity, is part of the human condition. Exploring is not limiting, it is universal. People of every background imagine new worlds. People from every corner of the globe search for the unknown, seeking out the unfamiliar and trying to understand it.
Many thanks to our guest author this evening, Professor Matthew Lockwood. We're so grateful you are with us. We hope to see you soon again. For now, a good night. And again, Matthew, thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.